My name is Daniel Robichaud, and for over 10 years I worked grounds at St. Gertrude Cemetery outside New Iberia, Louisiana. When I say I cleaned graves for a living, people usually picture somebody clipping grass around headstones, wiping bird mess off marble, maybe setting flowers upright after a storm. Some of that is true. Most days, that was the work. Bleach the mildew off family vaults. Scrape old candle wax from the little shelves people used for saints and photographs. Pump rainwater out of low spots after a hard night. Pick Spanish moss out of the iron fence before it stained. Wash the black streaks off white stone where years of damp had run down from the angels' faces and pooled under their mouths. That part of the job was ordinary. The part I don't talk about unless somebody asks me plain was in the back section, beyond the old live oaks, where the ground dipped a little and the grass never grew right. There was one grave there that never stayed empty. By evening, if things had gone the way they were supposed to, it would be cleared out, cleaned down, squared off, and left looking like nothing more than an old in-ground burial plot that had settled deeper than the others over time. By morning, there would be somebody in it. Not always someone we knew, not always someone who had been reported missing yet, not always someone who was cold. If that sounds like I'm trying to tell you a ghost story, I'm not. I'm telling you what my job turned into after the old sexton handed me a notebook and said there were rules the parish didn't write down. I followed those rules for almost 2 years before I broke one for the first time. I haven't had a full night's sleep since. St. Gertrude sat on a piece of raised ground about 15 minutes south of town, with cane fields on one side and a bayou road on the other. Most of the cemetery was what you'd expect from South Louisiana. Rows of above-ground family tombs, white or gray or weather-darkened. Some with little glass doors for candles, some with cracked ceramic flowers glued into holders that had rusted through years ago. There were bigger mausoleums up front, old money names on polished stone, and then simpler vaults farther back, where whole families had gone into concrete boxes one by one over the course of 50 or 60 years. I started there after the refinery outside Franklin, cut a round of contract labor, and I got caught in it. My father had done maintenance work all his life. I knew how to run equipment, how to fix a pump, how to keep a schedule, and how to work in heat without turning dramatic about it. St. Gertrude needed someone who would show up on time, keep his mouth shut around families, and not mind doing ugly work. I had a mother already sliding into the kind of old age that needs medicine, and somebody to drive her to appointments. The cemetery job came with parish insurance and a small shotgun house just outside the east gate. That was enough reason to say yes. For the first year, I mostly worked under Jules Landry. Jules was in his late 60s when I met him, narrow as a cane pole, skin the color of old saddle leather, always in long sleeves, even in August. He had a way of talking that made everything sound like it had already happened before, and would happen again whether you liked it or not. He kept the keys on a ring clipped to his belt, kept records in pencil, and never hurried unless rain was coming. He taught me the usual things first. It was months before he said anything to me about the back section. That part of St. Gertrude had older ground burials. Most of them from before above-ground vaults became standard on that property. A few had sunk over the years until the earth looked caved in around them. A few markers had tilted so badly you had to squat to read the names. One plot had no stone at all, just an iron stake about 2 feet high, with a rusted metal tag on it stamped with the number 39. It sat a little apart from the others, though not by much. If you didn't know what you were looking at, it would seem like a neglected grave in poor soil. What made it different was that the dirt there never set. Every other in-ground plot in that section packed down with time. You could cut the grass over it, trim the edges, tamp loose earth after rain, and it would hold. Plot 39 never did. The rectangle stayed soft, not muddy, exactly. Just loose enough that if you pressed the toe of your boot into the corner, It gave a little, as if the ground beneath had not decided what shape it wanted to keep. The first time I bent to pull weeds from the edge of it, Jules said, from behind me, quiet as if he didn't want to startle a dog, "Don't put your hands inside the line." I straightened and looked back at him. "Why?" He shrugged once. "Because I told you not to. But not that one." So I left plot 39 alone. Only I started noticing things. He never asked me to help. Once, after a night of hard rain, I saw him hosing mud off the shovel by the maintenance shed. There was dark soil up to the middle of the blade, and wet grass stuck along the edge, but it hadn't rained since before dawn. "Sinkhole?" I asked him. He looked at me for a second too long and said, "Something like that." The morning I found out what plot 39 really was started with a storm. Not a hurricane, just one of those summer blows that roll in off the Gulf after midnight and throw water sideways hard enough to rattle old glass. By 3 in the morning, one of the drainage pumps near the south wall had failed, and the cemetery office line kicked over to the number in my house. I got the call, dragged on boots, and drove through standing water with the wipers useless half the time. When I got to the shed, Jules's truck was already there. That alone felt wrong. He almost never came in during a storm unless there was a funeral scheduled the next morning, and there wasn't one. I found the south pump submerged, got it restarted, then went looking for him because the mule cart was missing too. The cemetery was still dark enough that the tombs ahead looked flat and black, where the security lights didn't reach. Water dripped off the live oaks. Somewhere beyond the chapel, a loose piece of metal kept ticking in the wind. I remember the smell more than anything else. Wet concrete, fresh-cut grass from the day before, and that deep swamp smell you get when rain wakes up the ground. I found the mule cart near the back section. Empty. The canvas square was gone. The shovel was leaned against the iron stake at plot 39. Jules was standing at the foot of the grave with both hands hanging by his sides, looking down into it. I called his name once. He didn't answer. I walked closer and saw he wasn't just standing there. He was swaying very slightly, like somebody fighting dizziness. I went up beside him and looked down before I thought better of it. There was a man in the grave. He lay on his back in the wet dark with his hands folded over his stomach, dressed in a gray work shirt and shrimp boots. Not buried, just placed there, neat as a viewing. Mud streaked his face and packed his hair flat. One side of his neck was caked black. His eyes were closed. His skin was the color of old wax. What bothered me first was not the body. It was the fact that the grave looked finished around him. The corners were sharp. The dirt rose clean around the shape of him, as if the earth had opened, received him carefully, and settled back without anybody touching a shovel. Jules said, without taking his eyes off the man, "You came too early." He sounded tired, not frightened, just worn through. "What the hell is this?" I asked. He shook his head once. "Not here." Then he bent down too fast, braced one hand on his knee, and I thought he was going to be sick. Instead, he sat down hard in the mud. I caught him before he rolled, dragged him back from the edge, and got him into the cart. His face had gone gray under the rain. At the shed, I called an ambulance, and while we waited, he gripped my wrist with more strength than I expected. "In the office," he said. "Bottom drawer. Black notebook." I said I'd get it. He held on tighter. "Read it all before dawn tomorrow." Then he let go and closed his eyes. He didn't die in the ambulance. He made it to the hospital and lasted through the day. I drove in after lunch with a change of clothes and the notebook, thinking maybe he'd want it back, but he was asleep and then too confused to talk plain. He died just after midnight. The priest called me at 6. By then, I had already read enough of the notebook to know Jules hadn't been losing his mind. The cover was plain black, the kind you buy in office supply packs. Inside, the first pages were dates, names, Short descriptions written in pencil so small and regular they looked printed. No introductions, no explanation, just entries. 411s, male, white, late 50s, oyster knife scar left palm, dry at dawn, claimed from bayou north of Lauroville at 2:40 p.m. 502, female, black, mid-30s, school shoes, ring missing, mother arrived before van, mistake, not repeated. 819s, juvenile, male, ribs audible, still warm. Father Martin called first. Page after page of that, years of it. Folded into the middle was a loose sheet written in heavier hand, the pencil lines dented deep enough to feel with my thumb. At the top, Jules had written, "If it's your turn, follow these in order." Under that were the rules. The first one said, "Do not go to 39 before first bird call. If you hear a voice from the grave before sunrise, do not answer it, do not look down into it, and do not let it use your name twice." The second, "At dawn, count the fingers and note the shoes before you look at the face. If you know who it is, say you do not until the van has passed the main gate." The third, "Do not remove anything from 39 unless it is flesh and scheduled to leave. No jewelry, paper, cloth, dirt, or photographs. What comes out wants a place to return to." The fourth, "If the body is wet with salt water, lock the gate and call Father Martin before the sheriff. Salt means early. Early is worse than late." The fifth, "If 39 is empty at dawn, close the cemetery and ring the chapel bell 3 times. Do not let a burial happen on the grounds that day." The sixth, "If you hear breathing from 39 after sunset, nail the board across and do not help whoever is asking." Then, in the margin at the bottom, cramped smaller than the rest, "If you ever see yourself in it, lie down where you are and keep your face in the grass until daylight. Do not run for the gate." I read that sheet 4 times before the sky evened into morning. At 7, the coroner called to ask if I was opening the east side for him, like it was any other day. That was when I understood that Jules had not been the only one carrying the thing. That first morning after his death, I did exactly what the notebook said. I waited in the maintenance shed until I heard grackles raising noise in the oaks by the front drive. Not wind, not trucks on the bayou road. Bird call. The notebook was in the pocket of my work shirt, damp from my hands. I took the mule cart out alone and parked it where Jules usually had. The sky was the color of dirty dishwater. Not dark anymore, but not bright enough to make the stone look honest. I could feel the grave before I got to it. That's the only way I know to put it. The back section always held a kind of low quiet, but that morning, it felt occupied in a way the rest of the cemetery didn't. Not loud, just attended. I kept my eyes level until I reached the iron stake. Even then, I had to force myself to look at the shoes first. Shrimp boots, black rubber, caked in dried mud up to the ankles. Then the hands, 6 fingers on the left. That detail hit me hard, because it was so plain, so ordinary in the middle of everything else. Somebody had lived a whole life with an extra finger, and either learned to joke about it, or got tired of the jokes and stopped answering them. It made him real in a way death usually strips away. Only then did I look at the face. I knew him from Del Combre, not well, just enough to place him. Albert Pitre. Ran a small shrimp boat with his nephew part of the year. Had a laugh you could hear across the fuel dock. I'd seen him at a bait shop maybe 2 weeks earlier. He was dead, no question of that. Mouth parted a little, mud dried in the crease beside his nose. Eyes closed as if someone had pinched them shut. But he wasn't cold, not body warm, not alive, just not as cold as he should have been after lying all night in wet ground. I stepped back and nearly put my heel into the grave edge. The coroner, Dr. Hebert, came out 10 minutes later in his dark county van and parked without hurry. He was a heavy man, with white eyebrows and the kind of face that could look sympathetic without promising anything. He nodded at me, looked once into plot 39 and said, "You're early in the learning." I asked him if he knew this man. He said, "You don't yet." Then he and I lifted Albert Petre out under the canvas square, put him into the van, and signed nothing. At 1:30 that afternoon, a deputy called the office asking if I had seen Albert's truck anywhere near the cemetery road because his nephew had just reported him missing. According to the nephew, Albert had gone out before dawn and never made it to the dock. Before dawn. I stood there with the phone in my hand and felt the sweat go cold between my shoulder blades. They found his skiff later that day, tangled in marsh grass. The public version was, he fell, hit his head, and drowned. Nothing in the paper about where he had been at sunrise. Nothing about his body already being on St. Gertrude property by then. That was the first rule proved. The second got proved 3 weeks later, and it cost more than a body. By then, I had settled into the routine Jules left me. That routine will do strange things to your mind. Nadine Blanchard came to St. Gertrude on a Tuesday in October. I remember the month because the heat had just started to let go a little at night, and people were already putting out early plastic chrysanthemums for All Saints. The morning was clear. No storm, no fog, nothing unusual except the sense I had, as I approached 39, that someone was standing just behind me. There was nobody there. I did what the notebook said, looked first at the shoes. Brown flats with a small brass buckle. Hands next, nails bitten short, ring finger pale where a band had been worn for years and removed recently, maybe for sizing, maybe for swelling, maybe for no reason that mattered now. I already knew before I looked at her face. When I saw her face, I said her name before I could stop myself. Just once, quiet. Nadine. The effect was immediate, and so small I might have convinced myself I imagined it, if it hadn't led to everything after. Her left eye opened. Only a slit, only for a second, enough to show white, with a muddy thread of brown across it. Then it shut again. I stepped back so fast I stumbled into the iron stake and rattled it. The sound seemed to carry farther than it should have. Then the chapel bell rang. Not hard, not a full peal, just one single strike, dull and heavy, as if somebody had pulled the rope once and let go. I stood there, staring toward the chapel, heart beating up into my throat, and by the time I looked back down, Nadine's face was still again. Dr. Hebert arrived with one deputy instead of the usual coroner assistant, Deputy LeBlanc, tall man, early 50s, thick neck, parish-born and permanently tired. When he saw my face, he asked what I'd done. I said, I knew her. He asked if I'd said it out loud. When I didn't answer right away, he closed his eyes for a second, not angry, just disappointed in the way men get when they know exactly which part of the work just got harder. Get the canvas, he said. We had just covered her when a car came hard up the gravel drive and stopped crooked by the back path. An older woman got out before the engine was dead, thin, house dress under a cardigan, one shoe unlaced. I knew her too, Nadine's mother. She didn't look at me. She looked straight toward plot 39, like she had been called to it. She crossed half the grass between us before he intercepted her. What happened? She kept asking. Where is she? I heard her. LeBlanc told her she needed to stop right there. Dr. Hebert told me under his breath to keep the canvas tight. Then, from under the sheet, in a voice so faint I felt it more than heard it, came the words, Mama, it's cold. Nadine's mother made a sound I still hear sometimes in my sleep. Not a scream, something lower, animal grief with surprise still mixed in. She shoved past LeBlanc with strength that shouldn't have been in a woman her age, and reached for the covered shape. I caught her by one arm. LeBlanc caught the other. Her nails tore the skin under my wristwatch as she fought us, not because she thought we were hurting Nadine, but because she thought we were keeping her from helping. That was the real horror of that morning. Not the eye, not the bell. Her mother's certainty that the voice under that sheet still belonged to her daughter in any human way. We got her back to the car. A neighbor who had followed behind took her home. LeBlanc stood with both hands on his hips and looked at the grave for a long time before saying, "That's why you don't name them here." I asked him if Nadine had spoken. He said, "No." But he didn't look at me when he said it. The official story was a car accident on Parish Road 318. She had gone off the shoulder in the dark and rolled into a canal. They found the vehicle later that afternoon, farther from the cemetery than made sense. The paper said she had likely drowned on impact. I saw the recovery photo clipped to a deputy's report 2 days later. In it, Nadine still wore the ring she hadn't had in Plot 39. By then, I had learned not to ask which body they had buried. The third rule was the one that came into my house. In November, Plot 39 gave me a boy named Lucas Melancon, 17, maybe 18. White t-shirt under an open flannel shirt, jeans wet from the knee down, one sneaker on, one bare foot filthy with black earth. His hands were scraped raw. There was a St. Christopher medal tangled in the shirt collar, cheap silver, chain broken. I knew the name before I knew the face, because there had been flyers up in town 3 days already. Lucas had gone missing after leaving a bonfire near Coteau. Last seen with 2 other boys, phone dead, truck found abandoned near a drainage canal. When I saw the medal, I made the mistake. It didn't feel like a mistake at the time. It felt like decency. So when I saw the broken chain at Lucas's throat, I thought of her. I unhooked the medal, wrapped it in a paper towel from the mule cart, and put it in my shirt pocket before Dr. Hebert arrived. All day, I meant to call her and say I had found something personal that might be his. I never made the call. That evening the weather turned colder than it had any business doing for South Louisiana. Not a front you'd remark on, just that dry kind of chill that gets into the boards of a house and makes old wood pop after dark. I ate reheated rice and sausage, washed my plate, and sat in the front room with the television on low, more for noise than attention. Around 9:30, I heard water drip in the back hall. I got up expecting a leak from the sink line. The hallway light was off, but I could see the kitchen tile by the moon through the back window, and there was mud on it, small patches at first, then clearer as I moved closer. A footprint, another, bare, narrow, with black dirt drying in the creases. They started at the back door, crossed the kitchen, and stopped at the sink. The back door was still locked. I stood there for a long time listening. Nothing. Then, from the bedroom, the cheap handheld radio I kept for cemetery calls crackled to life with a burst of static. I had turned it off when I came home. I went in slow. The radio was on the nightstand, hissing. Beside it, on the pillow where my head would have been if I'd gone to bed early, lay the St. Christopher medal. The paper towel was gone. The chain was clean. Around it, on the sheet, was a half-moon smear of wet dirt. My first thought was not that the boy had brought it back. Then the static on the radio thinned, and through it I heard breathing. Not words, not a voice, just a young person's shallow, stopped-up breath, the kind you hear through a blocked nose when somebody has been crying. I took the radio, the medal, and my truck keys and left the house without locking it, drove straight to the cemetery office, turned on every light, and sat there until dawn with Jules's notebook open in front of me. Rule 3 looked different after that. Do not remove anything from 39 unless it is flesh and scheduled to leave. No jewelry, paper, cloth, dirt, or photographs. What comes out wants a place to return to. When bird call came, I went to plot 39. Lucas was back. Not whole the way he had been the day before. Just the shape of a body under fresh earth, enough shoulder and cheek exposed to make recognition possible. The metal hung from the iron stake, turning slowly in the morning breeze. On the grave edge, laid carefully side by side, were my house key and the paper towel I had wrapped the metal in. After that, I stopped believing the fence line meant anything. The fourth rule was the one that convinced me the grave did not always hold the dead in the usual sense. The saltwater morning came during a stretch of clear weather. No storms in the Gulf that I knew of, no flood tide, no reason for St. Gertrude, sitting inland where it did, to smell like open seawater before sunrise. But that's what hit me when I stepped from the cart near plot 39. Salt, diesel, shrimp rot, the sharp mineral stink of a dock in summer. The man in the grave wore orange bib overalls under a slicker, both soaked through. His beard was clotted with sand, not mud, sand. Tiny pale grains dried at the corners of his eyes. One hand still clenched a piece of green rope so hard the knuckles showed white under the skin. I did not know him by face, but I recognized the company patch on the slicker. Offshore supply outfit out of Morgan City. I remembered the fourth rule and called Father Martin first. I asked why. Because if Jules wrote salt, then we treat salt the way he treated salt. Before I could do it, LeBlanc came in through the front drive and caught us on the path. "What's this?" he asked. I told him Father Martin wanted the gates shut. LeBlanc looked into the grave, took in the soaked clothes and said, "No, we move him like any other." The priest said, "Jules had a reason." LeBlanc snapped back, "Jules is dead." While we were zipping the black bag, I noticed something else. The man's lips were blue, but the seawater on his beard was fresh, not dried from a night in the elements, still wet. A clear drop fell from his chin and darkened the dirt beside the grave while I watched it. That afternoon, the call came in from the coast. The missing man was Captain René Gautreau, supply skipper out of Fourchon. According to his crew, he went overboard shortly after noon when a line snapped during a transfer. They had witnesses, timestamps, radio traffic, Coast Guard notes. Shortly after noon. By then, René Gautreau had already spent half the morning on a gurney at the parish facility. LeBlanc drove out himself just before dusk and told me Dr. Hebert wanted me to hear it from him, not from rumor. They had gone to recheck the body in cold storage after the offshore report came through. The bag on the tray was still zipped. Inside it were 2 rubber boots, a clump of wet sand, and enough seawater to soak the sheet beneath. No man. LeBlanc stood in the office while he told me that, hands on his belt, eyes on the floor like he was dictating a report to someone who had already decided not to believe him. Then he said, "From now on, if the notebook says lock the gate, you lock the gate." That was the last time anybody at St. Gertrude pretended the rules were old superstition. The 5th rule was the worst one before the last. Then one morning in late March, I waited for bird call, drove back, and found plot 39 empty. Not just no body. Empty in a deliberate way. The soil inside the rectangle was smooth, flat, and dark, as if freshly turned and patted down from within. No footprints around it. No animals had crossed. The iron stake with 39 on it stood straight. I don't mind telling you my first reaction was relief. Ugly, selfish relief. I looked at that cleared ground and thought, maybe whatever had been going on had ended with Jules, or with winter, or with some condition none of us understood. Then I remembered the rule. If 39 is empty at dawn, close the cemetery and ring the chapel bell 3 times. Do not let a burial happen on the grounds that day. There was a funeral scheduled at 10 for a woman named Teresa Comeau, 91 years old, buried next to a husband who had gone into the East Vault 20 years earlier. 50, maybe 60 people expected. Family driving in from Lafayette and Abbeville. A priest already booked, flowers already delivered and lined up in the chapel. I stood there looking at that flat black rectangle and understood, all at once, that the notebook had never been for curiosity. It was for choices like this, when doing what made sense would put the whole place in danger and make you sound insane while you tried to explain why. So I went to the chapel and rang the bell 3 times. The sound went across the cemetery heavy and slow, not like a service, more like an announcement nobody wanted. Then I shut the main gate, the east gate, and the side service gate by the shed. The first calls started within 15 minutes. I told all of them there was a grounds issue. By 8:30, LeBlanc was in my office wanting specifics. He listened without interrupting while I told him plot 39 was empty. The bell had been rung, and there couldn't be a burial that day. When I finished, he rubbed one hand over his jaw and stared past me through the office window toward the front rows of vaults. "Gameau's family isn't going to take that easy," he said. "I know. You want me to tell them why?" "No." That almost made him laugh. Good answer. He stayed anyway. The cemetery should have been still after that. It wasn't. The first thing I noticed was the birds. Normally, even on quiet days, St. Gertrude had noise in it. Grackles on the fence, sparrows in the hedge by the chapel, crows sometimes on the taller mausoleums where people left foil flower wrappers that shone in sun. After the bell rang, the whole place went blank. Not one bird on the property, not one call from the Oaks. Then there was the tapping. At around 11, a little girl from one of the cars outside the gate slipped away from her mother and squeezed through the bars before I saw her. She ran no more than 20 feet, straight down the center path in white shoes and a flower dress, then stopped so suddenly she nearly fell. When I reached her, she was staring toward the back section. "What is it?" I asked. She pointed past the rows of tombs. "That man's waving." Nobody was there. I picked her up and carried her back to the gate. Her mother apologized 6 different ways, embarrassed and flustered, but the child kept looking over my shoulder and twisting in my arms, as if she didn't understand why I was carrying her away from someone who had asked for help. Around noon, Dr. Hebert called from the parish office and asked if I had checked the old map drawer Jules kept locked. I said no. He told me to. The key was still on the ring Jules had given me, brass worn nearly smooth. In the bottom file cabinet under old plot sales and maintenance invoices, there was a tube of rolled plats, a stack of brittle burial permits, and one older survey drawn by hand on yellow paper. The back section wasn't labeled Plot 39 on that map. It was marked Receiving Ground. No family name, no individual stone, just a rectangular space outside the earliest formal rows, with a note beside it in faded ink, temporary placement for flood, and transit dead pending identification or church approval. Below that, in a different hand, added later, someone had written, "Use discontinued after incident, June 1919. No details, no description of the incident. I was still looking at that note when I heard shouting from outside. The Comeau family had decided old women with schedules and hearses should outweigh closed gates. One of the younger men had climbed the side fence far enough to unlatch the service entrance from the inside. The hearse rolled in before I could stop it, followed by 3 cars, all of them moving at the careful, slow speed people use in cemeteries, because even angry people feel the place pressing against their habits. LeBlanc went out swearing. Father Martin went out after him. I came from the office with the map still in my hand and saw the hearse pull up beside the chapel. "Back them out," I said. The funeral director, who knew better than any of us how not to make a scene, said, "Daniel, I'm trying." They were already carrying the casket toward the east vault before the argument finished. It didn't. Then, just as they set the casket on the straps over the open vault, all the candles inside the chapel went out at once. Nobody saw that happen but me. I was turned halfway toward the building when it went dark through the front windows. At almost the same moment, one of the pallbearers froze and looked down. "What's that?" he said. We all listened. From the vault opening below, Teresa Comeau's casket came 3 slow knocks. The sound was unmistakable. Not settling concrete, not loose hardware, knuckles, or something close enough to knuckles that every person there heard the difference. One of the daughters let out a cry and backed into the flower stand. Another pallbearer dropped his end of the strap. The casket tilted hard enough that 2 men grabbed it before it slid. Then the knocking came again, this time from deeper down, as if there were a second chamber under the one that had been opened. LeBlanc ordered everybody back. Father Martin started saying something low and Latin under his breath. The funeral director looked like he might actually faint. I walked to the vault edge before I had time to talk myself out of it and looked down. There was nothing visible under the casket, just the concrete chamber, dark and square, and the slick metal rails waiting to take the weight. But on the far inner wall, where no moisture should have been, there were 5 fresh streaks of black dirt. Long, narrow, finger-shaped. I did not need anyone to tell me what it meant. Plot 39 had not been empty because it was done. It had been empty because whatever belonged there had room to move. We stopped the burial. No one argued after that. By sunset, the gates were locked again, and St. Gertrude had the look of a place that had been embarrassed in public. I went to Plot 39 before dark. Still empty. Not smooth anymore, though. The flat soil had split down the middle in a hairline seam no wider than a finger. When I crouched beside it, I could smell wet concrete and old flowers, as if the whole cemetery's breath had been pushed into that one opening. That was the night I found the last pages in Jules's notebook. They had been tucked under the back cover, folded into the spine where I hadn't seen them before. Not rules this time. Notes. Short, blunt, written like reminders to himself. Receiving ground used during 1918 fever and 1919 flood. Bodies held overnight when church refused immediate burial, or families not yet found. Woman in June record spoke after placement. Priest said living. Dug up at dawn. Empty coffin by dusk. Do not let them tell the story as a mistake in records. Mistakes don't repeat for 80 years. Then one line by itself. It doesn't take the dead. It borrows the nearly dead and rehearses them. A little after 9, something hit the side of the house hard enough to shake the glass. I froze, waited. Then from outside, on the packed dirt just beyond the kitchen wall, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, dragging, wet. They crossed under the window and stopped at the back steps. I moved to the sink, bent just enough to see the porch through the screen, and caught only the lower half of a figure standing on the steps. Bare ankles black with mud. One sneaker, one bare foot. Lucas, or enough of him to make my stomach turn. He lifted one foot and tapped the door twice with the dirty toenails. Then something spoke from farther out in the yard. Not Lucas's voice, Jules's. Don't let him in, Daniel. The porch steps creaked as whatever was out there shifted its weight. Then the dragging footsteps moved away from the house and back toward the cemetery road. If you hear breathing from 39 after sunset, nail the board across and do not help whoever is asking. Up to that point, I had taken that rule as precaution, like the others. Something to do if the grave changed its habits. The morning after the empty day, I realized the grave had already started changing them for me. I went out before sunrise and found Plot 39 occupied again. only this time there was no full body. Just a shape under the dirt from chest to knees, as if someone had been laid down and covered in a hurry, with the head and feet left for later. The seam in the middle of the grave had widened to a split. From inside it, just once, came a single wet inhale. I did not wait to see if it would happen again. I took the board Jules kept by the shed for storm closures, laid it across the opening, and nailed it down over the grave like he had written. Before I had driven the last nail, something below the board knocked 3 times from underneath. That was the first time I understood the 6th rule was not about the thing in the grave needing help. It was about it knowing how to ask for the right person. By afternoon, LeBlanc was back at my office with a missing person notice in his hand. His son, Levi, had not come home the night before. Levi was 19, broad-shouldered, easy grin, worked part-time at a welding yard, and fished every chance he got. I had seen him at the gas station by the highway more than once, buying ice and sunflower seeds in the same trip, like every other young man around there. If you had asked me the day before whether I could picture him in Plot 39, I would have told you no on reflex, the same way people say no to things the mind refuses to set in place. LeBlanc laid the notice on my desk and said, "His truck's at the launch, wallet inside, phone gone." I looked at him and knew immediately he had already connected it. He wasn't there to ask whether the grave might be involved. He was there because the question had already settled on him, and he needed to hear how much time he had before dawn. "Come back tonight," I said. He stared at me. "Why tonight?" "Because if I tell you before I show you, you won't believe me the right way." That angered him for about a second. Then it left. He was too tired and too scared to waste it. He came back a little before sunset, with a board from his truck bed and a cordless drill. He didn't ask what they were for. I took him to the back section, showed him Plot 39, showed him the nails I had driven that morning, and then showed him the split in the soil at one end, where the board had lifted a fraction, as if something underneath had tested it during the heat of the day. LeBlanc did not say much. Men like him don't, when reality finally catches up with the private dread they've been building all afternoon. He helped me set a second board crosswise and screw both into stakes at the corners. When we were done, the grave looked less like a burial plot than a covered well. The sun dropped. The cemetery went blue in that brief hour before full dark, when the white vaults still seemed to hold their own light. Father Martin joined us with a flashlight and a length of rosary wound around one fist, not because I think he believed the beads themselves would stop anything, but because a man reaches for whatever has ordered his life when the world starts refusing order. We stood there and listened. Nothing at first. Then, from under the boards, breathing. Slow, wet, human. LeBlanc went rigid beside me. A moment later came a voice. "Mama?" Not Levi. Nadine. It came thin and muffled, like someone calling through soaked cloth. LeBlanc looked at me sharply. Father Martin shut his eyes. The voice came again, weaker. "Mama, I'm cold." Then a pause. Then Lucas, young and raw. "I can't breathe." My hands went numb around the hammer I was carrying. LeBlanc crouched and put one hand on the upper board before I could stop him. "Levi," he said. There was a long silence from underneath. Then, in Levi's voice, clear enough that all 3 of us heard the shape of the boy in it, came the answer. "Daddy." LeBlanc reached for the drill. I caught his forearm. "No." He jerked free hard enough to nearly pull us both off balance. "That's my son. It's using him. You don't know that." I said, "I know exactly that." He looked at me the way men look when they need to hate the person telling them the truth, because the truth itself has nowhere for the anger to land. Then he dropped to one knee and started backing screws out of the board with hands that shook so badly he stripped the first one. Father Martin said very quietly. If he is still alive in any way God recognizes, this is not where he should be met. LeBlanc didn't stop. By the time the second screw came free, the breathing below had changed. It was faster now, closer. I could hear mud shifting against wood with each inhale. When the last screw came out, the board rose half an inch from the pressure beneath. LeBlanc ripped it aside. Levi was in the grave. At least, that was my first thought. His upper body was there, face and shoulders and chest, smeared black with wet soil, eyes open and fixed on his father. His lips were cracked with mud in the corners. One hand reached upward, fingers trembling. But below the ribs, the earth had not released him. There were no legs visible, no lower body pushing against the dirt, just Levi from the waist up, emerging from packed black ground as if the rest of him went down farther than a grave should have depth for. LeBlanc dropped to both knees and took his son by the forearms. The soil around Levi's sides moved like something breathing under a blanket. "Come on," LeBlanc said. "Come on, son." Levi's eyes never left his father's face. "You came late." Those weren't the words of a frightened boy. They were matter of fact, mild, almost, like an observation in a waiting room. LeBlanc pulled. For 1 second, Levi rose an inch, maybe 2. Black dirt stretched and cracked along his waist. I heard a sound like wet cloth tearing somewhere deep below him. Then Levi smiled. Not wide, not monstrous, just enough for me to see that the mud packed behind his teeth wasn't mud at all. It was dark water, moving. He turned his head toward me and said, in the same calm voice, "He wrote the last rule down for you." Then he spoke 6 names. Albert Pitre, Nadine Blanchard, Lucas Melancon, René Gautreau, Teresa Comeau, Jules Landry. Each one came out with a little more water in it than the last. Then he said my name, Daniel. The grave heaved. LeBlanc shouted and pulled again. The dirt at Levi's waist collapsed inward all at once, not swallowing him downward but taking him sideways, as if an arm underground had yanked him into a space running beneath the cemetery. One instant his hands were in his father's grip, the next there was only black soil spilling into the hole, and LeBlanc falling backward with a strip of torn flannel sleeve and 3 deep scratches bleeding across his wrist. Father Martin hauled him up. I slammed the board back across the grave, drove 2 nails home with the first wild hits my hands could manage, then 2 more, until the wood stopped jumping under my palm. Underneath it, Levi kept breathing for maybe 10 seconds, then not at all. At dawn the next morning, after bird call, I pried the board up with LeBlanc and Father Martin standing back from the edge. Levi was there, whole this time, cold, lying on his back in clean order, one hand over his chest, the other at his side, mud in his hair. No wound on him bigger than what a boy might pick up stumbling in the dark. LeBlanc made no sound. He stood looking down at his son, with his bandaged wrist hanging useless by his side, and a face so emptied out, it frightened me worse than grief usually does. Dr. Hebert came. The van came. Paperwork happened somewhere else under some other version of mourning. The public story was that Levi drowned after drinking near the launch and falling from the dock. LeBlanc signed it. I told him no. I don't know whether that was kindness or cowardice. But by then the grave had learned my name properly. In May, the parish president came out with 2 maintenance men and an engineer from Lafayette, who spent 15 minutes looking at plot 39 from a safe distance, and another 10 saying words like subsidence and historical instability and liability exposure. Their solution was the same one frightened officials always arrive at when they need to feel useful: cover it. They ordered a concrete cap poured over the receiving ground and the iron stake removed. So we did it. A crew came on a Thursday. By noon, plot 39 was boxed, and filled with reinforced concrete thick enough to cap a septic trench. The iron stake, with the rusted metal tag, was taken up and tossed into the bed of a parish truck. The storm came after midnight. Not a hurricane, not even a named system. Just a Gulf squall with hard wind, driving rain, and enough lightning to turn the cemetery white every few seconds. The office alarm tripped at 2:13 a.m. I thought maybe a branch had come down through the chapel windows. I got dressed, grabbed the flashlight and keys, and drove in. Even before I reached the gate, I could tell something had changed. The cemetery lights were out. Every one of them. The only illumination came from lightning and the weak yellow beam of my truck through the rain. The front gate stood open. I knew I had locked it. I left the truck running and went in on foot. Water ran down the center path in narrow, dark streams. The vaults flashed white and vanished white again. Somewhere metal was striking stone in a regular, slow rhythm. When the lightning hit clean over the back section, I saw that the concrete cap on plot 39 was gone. Not broken. Gone. The ground where it had been was open again, black and deep, with the rain vanishing into it instead of pooling. I heard someone behind me and turned with the flashlight up. It was LeBlanc, soaked through, one hand wrapped in plastic over the still healing cuts on his wrist. "I got the alarm too," he said. We went together. As we passed the east rows, I noticed several of the family vault doors standing slightly open, not wide, just enough to show black seams where they should have been shut. I told myself the wind had done it. Then I heard footsteps on wet concrete ahead of us. Not ours. Slow, measured, moving parallel to the path from one row to the next. LeBlanc heard it too. He lifted his flashlight, but the beam only struck rain and white walls. When we reached the back section, something was lying in plot 39. At first I thought it was the concrete cap itself somehow folded into the grave. Then lightning hit, and I saw cloth. A man in a dark work shirt lay on his side with one arm bent under him. Mud packed the seams of the shirt. Rain ran over the back of his neck. One hand rested open on the grave edge, as if he had almost managed to pull himself out. The shirt was mine. Same faded blue patch over the pocket. Same tear at one cuff, where I had caught it on chain link a month earlier. Same parish logo stitched crooked by the uniform company. LeBlanc said my name, but it sounded far away. The figure in the grave began to turn over. That was when I remembered the line in Jules's margin. "If you ever see yourself in it, lie down where you are, and keep your face in the grass until daylight. Do not run for the gate." Every instinct I had said run anyway. The gate was 50 yards at most, maybe less. But when I looked up from the grave toward the main path, the distance had changed. The rows seemed longer, the white vaults farther apart, the front oaks impossibly far down a corridor of stone and rain that St. Gertrude did not physically contain. The thing in my shirt rolled onto its back. I did not look at the face. I dropped where I stood, turned my head into the wet grass, covered the back of my neck with both arms, and shut my eyes. LeBlanc swore at me, then ran. I heard his footsteps slapping water on the path, heard them keep going, and going. Too long, much too long for a cemetery that size. Then came the sound that still wakes me some nights. Not a scream. A man suddenly realizing the ground ahead of him has opened somewhere it should not be. After that, only rain. I stayed where I was. Something walked around me in the grass for what felt like an hour and could not have been more than minutes. I smelled wet earth, brine, old flowers, then cold diesel, then the bitter bleach we used on marble. Once a drop of water fell from above onto the back of my neck, even though there were no trees over me in that part of the section. Once something crouched close enough beside my head that I could hear mud shifting as it breathed through a human nose. And through all of it, just beyond the blood beating in my ears, I heard my own voice moving through the cemetery in the dark. Calm, practical, familiar, checking pumps, opening gates, calling plot numbers, saying, over and over, by morning, by morning, by morning. Birds woke the world before the light fully came. That first grackle call hit me like a hand on the shoulder. I opened my eyes to gray dawn, soaked through, face pressed into flattened grass. The cemetery was itself again. Short rows, front oaks where they belonged, vault doors shut. Plot 39 held one body. Deputy LeBlanc lay in it, on his back, hat gone, uniform shirt open at the throat, mud packed in one ear. His wounded wrist had been folded across his chest, as neatly as if someone had arranged it with care. His face was calm. Too calm, not peaceful, just absent of the panic I knew had been in him when he ran. Beside his left hand, half buried in the loose dirt, was the rusted metal tag from the iron stake. 39. The parish said LeBlanc collapsed in the storm, while responding to the alarm. The parish says a lot of things. And me, I stayed. People ask why. On the rare occasions I tell any of this at all, the answer is simple enough. Because somebody has to go out there at first light. Because rules only work if a living person still follows them. Because after LeBlanc, there was no one left who knew what the bell meant when it rang 3 times before breakfast. I moved out of the house by the east gate. I rent a place in town now, farther from the cemetery road, though not so far that I can't get there fast if the office line rings after midnight. I keep Jules's notebook in a kitchen drawer wrapped in plastic against the damp. I have copied the rules twice by hand, in case pencil finally fades. I still wait for bird call. I still look at the shoes first. And every evening, if plot 39 has been emptied and the van has gone and the dirt has been squared, I clean that grave myself. I brush the loose earth back inside the line. I rinse whatever stain is left on the clay. I pick out grass roots and cloth threads and anything else that might let it think part of the day belongs somewhere beyond that rectangle. Then I leave it neat. Not because I believe neatness matters to the dead, because I have come to believe that whatever uses that ground likes a place prepared for it. Some mornings I find strangers. Some mornings I find people from the parish whose names won't hit the news until lunch. Once, last year, I found a man wearing an out-of-state hunting jacket with my old house key in his pocket. I threw the key into the bayou on the way home and changed my locks anyway. I never learned what happened in June of 1919. Maybe a woman was buried breathing. Maybe a priest lied to keep panic out of a flooded parish. Maybe the receiving ground held too many bodies that had not been properly named, blessed, or claimed, and something about that stacked debt never settled. I don't know. What I do know is this. People think the horror of a cemetery is that the dead might rise out of it. That isn't what scares me. What scares me is a piece of ground that keeps making room. And if you ever drive south of New Iberia just after sunrise, and you pass an old cemetery where one section in the back looks darker than the rest, do not stop to watch the groundsman working there. If he keeps his head down and refuses to wave, he is not being rude. He is counting fingers. He is checking the shoes. And he is trying very hard not to learn your name before morning. Because I don't clean that grave because someone is buried there. I clean it because by morning, someone will be.